everyone, and welcome to the ESL Grand Final of Thessaloniki Worlds 2016. Judging this final will be myself as chair, with me John McKee, Edward Merrill, Colin Bessans, Arena Naiwa, Samuel War-Packard, Sela Nevo, Ellie Zossa, and Sophie Large. In opening government, we have Indonesia A. In opening opposition, RWTH Aachee A. In closing government, we have Seoul A. And in closing opposition, DLSU A. This motion comes with a prompt which goes as follows. It is certainly true that in steps with the process of globalization, the sovereignty of nation-states, while still effective, has progressively declined. The primary factors of production and exchange, money, technology, people, and goods, move with increasing aids across national boundaries. Hence, the nation-state has less and less power to regulate these flows and impose its authority over the economy. Even the most dominant nation-states should no longer be thought of as supreme and sovereign authorities, either outside or even within their own borders. This is from Hart and Negri, the Empire. The motion in front of the House is, this House supports the decline of the nation-state's power in an increasingly globalized world. And without any further ado, the House recognizes the Prime Minister.
Test. Ladies and gentlemen, we think that in the globalized world, self-determination of individuals should not be limited by the borders of the state or the definition of nationality that the state define with its power. The world that we imagine in opening government with the decline of nation-state power will look like this. Number one, we think that there will be less and less likely regulation coming from the state to limit economic activity from the individuals and allow individuals to invest in various forms of businesses, allows individuals to invest their capitals in other nations without any barriers established by states in forms of cost, for example. We also think that the decline of nation-state power will result in a globalized world in which that free trade agreement or free trade pact is not dominated by dominant countries and initiated by dominant countries such as China with the AFTA agreement and also United States with the TPP. We think that, secondly, in opening government, we don't want a world in which that a dominant state control other countries through its powers, through its economic powers, through its military power. We think that in our world, power will be distributed equally among countries, and that is the future that we envision in the opening government. Here's some portion of clarification that we have in the opening government. What do we mean by globalized world? Globalized world means that there is an economic interdependence in which that one state can only survive if they can create a bilateral agreement or regional agreement with other states in creating a beneficial economic activities. There's also a freedom of information for individuals to access on the status quo without any limitations, without any limitations. Furthermore, we think that what do we mean by nation-state of power is the manifestation of nation-state most likely will be in the form of regulations that limits individuals' freedoms according to the political incentives of that particular nations. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to bring you 3 points of substantive in my speech. Number one, why we think that the nation-state power is necessarily bad for the society to define the self-identity they would like, that they would like to have in the globalized world, and why we think that the economy interdependence will be better off in our proposal, which will not result in monopoly by certain dominant state. Lastly, I'm going to talk about why peace will be most likely if we have less nation-state decided to police the world in the current status quo. Before that, yeah.
Sir, an inability to dominate a local industry is a big disincentive for for industries to cross borders. If you want globalization and you want equal power between countries at the same time, how in the world are you going to make that happen?
Yeah, it's hypothetically, it can happen, ladies and gentlemen. We think that when there's not a monopoly from dominant states, we think that the power will be distributed equally, because most likely, in my arguments, I'll explain, this monopoly will result in the exploitation of developing countries. But firstly, why we think that the power of nation state in creating regulation is really bad for individuals in globalized world. Number one, most likely, ladies and gentlemen, the way the state define their power will be manifested in their policies in defining what does it mean to be Americans, for example. These policies will define the identity of each individual to make sure that they are able to contribute back to the state. And we think that oftentimes, ladies and gentlemen, most likely this regulation will be very biased to the political incentives that sits in power to that particular governments. We think that, for example, when the government are dominated by Democrats, most likely the way that you define yourself to be an American would be a liberal individuals that would like to associate yourself with liberal values. No, thank you. We think that this hampers the ability of individuals to associate themselves with the alternative forms of self-identity that they would like to define themselves as Americans. In comparison, ladies and gentlemen, we think that in opening government, we think that when there is a declining of state power in which that state are not able to create policies in defining what does it mean to be Americans, most likely individuals will have more freedom in defining their identity as individuals in the current status quo. So most likely, ladies and gentlemen, because states are not imposing regulations, for example, like in order for you to be Americans, most likely you need to agree that we don't have progressive taxes in the status quo. Most likely, ladies and gentlemen, you will have the ability to define your own self better. But second, ladies and gentlemen, the most important thing in today's debate, why we think that economic problem will not be a case in the opening government. The problem in the status quo, when there is a powerful nation state, the capital are centered to the government of that particular state. And oftentimes, the resources who are centered to this particular state are being used to establish outsourcing companies in developing countries that resulted in exploitations of other laborers in other developing countries. No, thank you. Why this is necessarily bad and why this is exclusive when we have a power? Because the incentive that these particular dominant states would like to have in the status quo is to control as much market as possible. This will result in the ability of these particular states to control the government in developing countries. Comparatively, ladies and gentlemen, we think that in opening government, we think that it will be better off. Why? Because when the distribution of power are equal between states, ladies and gentlemen, most likely countries such as developing countries will not bow down to the developing countries' incentive in creating exploitation in their particular own territory. But second, ladies and gentlemen, we think that when there is no nation state in the globalized world, most likely there will be a standard of how a government should look like in the status quo. What do we mean by that? When we have United States, for example, in defining that a state necessarily need to be always democratic, that a state necessarily need to always sacrifice the freedom of religion and need to always sacrifice stability over freedom of expression, we think that most likely in our proposal this will not happen, because we think that when there is no nation-state power, there will be no standardization of how a government should look like. And we think that the manifestation of the way that United States government define the stability of the country will result in exporting democracies that taking away other countries' territory and taking away the authority of developing countries' government in the current status quo. We are very proud to propose.
We thank the Prime Minister for that speech, and the House now recognizes Leader of the Opposition.
Opening government wants to go for freedom. Opening government wants to give everyone the individual freedom that they think they deserve. But we think to the degree that they're weakening democracies, that freedom cannot be guaranteed for the weakest ones on our planet, for those that already have the lowest stake in today's world. And we say that globalization, and which is the process by which these nation states are weakened, is the very process that takes this freedom away from so many of us. And we think that globalization in a process which at the same time weakens the sovereignty of nation states is not really good globalization, and that we say that when you weaken the nation state, these weak people might have the freedom to do something on paper, but in the end, it's really just an individualization of a collective failure, because they cannot anymore effectively lobby any governments or anyone into doing things which affect their lives. Right? What they say is, firstly, that you somehow now have the choice to do the things that you like, that you somehow now can choose your identity. But we think that is mainly true for those people who profit from nation states getting worse. And who are those people? Those are the people who are actively competing with the boundaries of legislation that native states set out there. They are the people who are exploiting societies, right? It's the big companies who compete with how much they can derive of an individual society, and not the weak ones, which usually profit from the protection that society can offer them. Where a strong democracy actually has rules which can say that if we're strong enough, we can force our companies not only to stay here, but also to enforce, for example, like labor regulations. But in a world where we lose that, and where we, for example, can be influenced by ISDSs and other processes of like non-sovereign influences by, for example, companies or rich influences, we say that the losers of this are oftentimes the very people that you want to give this liberty to. And secondly, you say that the economic problem will not, that there will be less of an economic problem because now everyone is sort of equal because everyone has lost sovereignty. But let's look at reality. Which states lose their sovereignty fastest? And what is it overtaken by, right? Often we see that weak states, especially economically weak states, get their sovereignty overtaken by stronger entities. And these are not always companies and rich individuals, but oftentimes these are rich states like, for example, China. Right? We see that Zimbabwe right now has given away a huge parts of its sovereignty in allowing China to have its currency also being used as a currency within their country. We say that that's a huge loss of sovereignty, and therefore it's not clear how other countries will have less of an influence on your side of the house, right? So what do we think, right? We think that in this process, we should, when we go about having a world where there's more globalization, there really probably is only a mathematical argument to be made for globalization, where on average probably you have lower production costs because of an economy of scales on a globalized sphere is somehow better for the economy mathematically. But we say that this theoretical profit usually only goes to the people who right now are in control of the entities which can take advantage of this, right? They are in the hands of the big companies. And this is a huge problem because this leads to these companies being able to dictate national policies, right? We see this in several ways, right? First, we see this in taxation, right? Even though the American state has created like great companies, for example, like Apple, because they have lost sovereignty and sovereign power, most of their taxes do not get paid because they're not powerful enough anymore to do this. What does that lead to, right? The profits of Apple don't go to everyone within the US, right? Even though everyone within the US is responsible for this by providing an infrastructure which makes the creation of a company like Apple possible through education, through streets, through universities, right, which this company profits from. But actually the profits go to the globalized shareholders of this, right? So at this point we say that we really regret that the process of the nation states getting weaker is a process of globalization where the advantages only go to a few. But what's the impact of this? Why is this so harmful? We say this is incredibly harmful because this leads to a lobbying within the countries to worse policies and to a parallel system for these globalized players, right? We see this already in the US, and we find it very puzzling that they use the US as a positive example of this, right? We see already that you have to kind of get a lot of support from the very rich, right? We see that Hillary Clinton is backed by the biggest companies within the US, right? And therefore we see that her policies are most likely not going to be against them and to the least not like neutral towards them, right? I recently read someone having a very good analogy on this, but before I tell you that analogy, I'm running out of time and I would like to take a question from closing if they have one.
The point is that a result of a weaker nation or a stronger nation that structurally oppresses and rules out minorities like laborers?
I didn't get the second part of this, but I think it was about nations suppressing their own population. I'm not entirely sure. But I think that we can also deal with this through sovereign states, and we don't think that like sovereign states losing their power necessarily leads to this process getting better, right? We don't think that globalization made like the workers in countries where there's like sweatshops and so on, like we don't think that globalization has done anything good for them. And we think that their governments are often like partners in crime of like using globalization to suppress these people, right? So to that degree, if I understand the question correctly, I don't think it's true, right? So the analogy is that we don't think that in governments where these huge economic factors play a huge role, where countries like Luxembourg and the Netherlands like specifically cater their tax policy towards the rich and globalized, that you're actually having effective policy anymore. It's as if Hillary Clinton would have said that she's willing to carry the ring all the way to Mordor, wearing it, and then in the end throwing it into the volcano. We don't think this will happen, and we say that this is to the detriment of everyone within these societies. We want, to the degree that we want globalization, we want it in a world where there's a strong nation state that can cater towards the democratic interest of the people, because democracies protect the weakest of us, and not only the strongest. Therefore, we are very proud to oppose. Thank you.
We thank the Leader of Opposition for that speech, and the House now recognizes Deputy Prime Minister.
Ladies and gentlemen, Team Opposition cannot win this debate by saying they want both globalization and government still in control. But because that cannot be achieved hand in hand. Because we have to recognize when globalized world is involved, that means country will be interdependent and going to be like handled in a free market system where government will less likely have the power to control one another. And that side of the house needs to also argue to you why control between country and within the country themselves is important to take place, why we think it's the hindrance to create a maximum development that is evenly distributed throughout the world. I'm going to deal first why we think globalization and a true form of globalization is the best way. Because in globalization, that means no country can control one another, because in the world that we envision, there will be no country that is dominant both in military and economy. We think that in that sense, all part of society and countries can equally contribute and equally have value, and that means all countries will be equally interdependent within each other. So I'm going to talk about three contention in my speech. I'm going to talk about economic distribution. I'm going to talk about secondly, national identity, the exclusive contribution that was poorly engaged by team opening opposition, and lastly, why we think that military power that is concentrated by two or like polar country is definitely bad to create some more country that create a world that will be that would have peace in the future. Now let's talk about the economic distribution, right? Because this is the main contention that they say. They say that the people in the bottom of the pyramid will be harmed when there is a globalization world and where the country is losing the power. We think here's the characterization that was missing from the opening opposition. The reason why company is bad is not because it's inherently evil. Let's characterize how the country interact with the how company interact with the country that they come in developing and underdeveloped nations, right? The reason why they count those countries that are underdeveloped and developing countries willing to race to the bottom, reducing all the requirements to get investors, are because they are insecure that there are other dominant countries out there that are just way too strong. So the only way for them to be able to compete or to be able to be accepted in the international framework and to be recognized as an equally important nation is to just lower all the regulation and in the future get all the investors that they need. In our proposal, in our world, that's not going to happen, because none of the country will feel insecure if they have less money, because the other country are equally integrated with them, are equally dependent, and no country is going to be much more powerful and can dictate in the future what your economy should be. Within our world after this, the globalization to fully unfold requires a larger freedom. We think through bargaining diplomacy, like what was promised by opening opposition, it's going to be filled with political nuance. Instances number one, Indonesia and Israel are unable economically ties themselves because the government decides not to do that. In our world, that is possible to happen. Like the cases of United States and Myanmar, there is also filled with political nuance. Thus, the economic decision are unable to fully unfold. In our world, because the company are integrated and interdependent with other nations to contribute to, like, for example, their production factors and so on and so forth, we think that will lead into a possibility of integration and in the future economic cooperation that is much more better and free from political nuance that was most likely beneficial for the society at large. Closing.
If countries are too economically interdependent and one economy crashes, how will the world recover without nation-states having the capacity to control their own economy?
We think that when countries are already interdependent, control from the state is no longer relevant because everyone will be able to self-regulate themselves. All countries will have equal bargaining chip to control the company and control other countries. On that side of the house, they cannot just simply say that government can regulate without necessarily understanding that there is a huge possibility where government will be filled with political nuance and political bias that would necessarily harm economic development for countries that is in opposed with that political view to begin with. Now, the second idea that we think is important, we think that in an interdependent world, national identity should be less and less credited, because we think, in case in point, where a country is very much powerful like United States, the narrative of being, for example, as a United States citizen, you should always support foreign policy because we are the police of the world. These types of narrative is a narrative that is bad and always pointed to the fact that you have a shared a national identity, that you should always go with that idea. We think that because these types of national identity is harmful and continuously needs to be criticized, we think that can only happen if government has less and less control to the society to the society and to the other country at large. Within that national identity that is very much emboldened and very much sculptured within the mind of the society is bad. But the last point that we think is more important in regards to military. Because what you need to understand in the status quo, there are countries that is very dominant in terms of their military power, like United States and other Western countries. We think that the supremacy of power leads to insecurity that is totally bad for peace, right? Because you have to bear in mind, there are cases in which there are countries like Iran, there are countries like Syria that feel threatened because West is trying to invade and intervene in this country because they have all the power that they require to do so. We think that when countries feeling insecure and feeling threatened by this, we think that that is bad because they will sacrifice any other means that is required to satisfy the welfare of the society just to keep up and to maintain themselves in power. How do we envision the world in our proposal? It's going to be much better because there is no country that's going to be dominant in military. So in the end of the day, in our world, because the country have interdependence, it is less likely for within country to want to attack each other because they have the importance to maintain the relationship within other countries. We know that all of the proposals that were brought by team government is very hypothetical, but this hypothetical debate needs to unfold because in the growing globalization world, this is the world that we envision. And this world can only take place to be best if government lessen their control over the country and lessen the control over its society. We will have places where there is no race to the bottom. We will have no military supremacy. We are more than proud to propose this motion.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech, and now the House recognizes Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Oh God. Oh my God. Because when you're talking about democracy and peace and global politics, we think then it would be way wiser to invest in stronger states, in stable institutions, in working democracies, and not to erode these stable states and stable institutions and put what in their place. That's the next challenge that we are posing to side government, because what we're saying is we have a bit of a regulation gap right now without these states, without what they're doing, and they have no alternatives. What we're saying is that some things in this world need to be regulated, need to be enforced to protect people's rights and interests. This is, for example, privacy, like my right to have private emails, which is right now a huge problem for me and many others. For example, the financial system with the financial meltdown that we had a couple of years ago. These are things that definitely need to be regulated, but under their model, that's very much unlikely. We have ecological problems that need a strong state hand, that need to be regulated. We think that's not going to happen under their side of the house. We think with the nation states that we're having right now, we're having a well-working model for how to regulate these things. What does that mean? Because in these nation states, or in our ideal version of a well-working nation state, we have like a cohesive and reasonably homogeneous body of people who are willing to have some form of shared authority and to accept this particular shared authority. And by that, we think that we are able to, to a strong and reasonable degree, gather their interests, implement them in policy, and enforce these particular interests, thereby regulating all these things. We think by this mechanism that we are having right now, we can do great things. We think we have nothing like that under their side of the house. There's no world government inside or on the horizon which might be remotely able to regulate these things. Why? Because the people of these worlds are way too heterogeneous to come to any form of consensus, and they have way too diverse interests to be willing to sacrifice their own sovereignty to some other institution. We think because we're lacking these institutions, because we need to regulate some things, like the nation states, the only thing that we're having right now to do these things should be the way to go. They need to give us an alternative, and we think that's very difficult because just as the world is right now, an alternative is not in sight. We think that's a huge problem. What's next? A nice example for that is finance. We think that the greatest example for that is the regulation of the financial markets. We had a huge financial crisis in the US and the whole world, and these financial crises, they are connected to huge worldwide economic recession, downfalls, recessions. People are really suffering because of this. Once we have these economic meltdowns, we think they can, to a large extent, be preempted by reasonable regulation, by what was it called, Tobin tax, by taxation on trades of shares, by these kind of things. Yeah? But these are only things that you can do within a nation state, within some form of stable institution, which is able to enforce these measures. If you're eroding that, then you have no ability to control, for example, the financial sector, and you are very, very vulnerable to another financial meltdown. We think that, again, is not in the interest of the people. That is a nice illustration of this particular point. What else do we have? Developing nations. What they're saying is, but the status quo disadvantages developing or weak nations. What we're saying is globalization and the erosion of nation-state power disadvantages developing nations. Why is that? Well, first of all, in a way, it makes it impossible for them to develop economically, reasonably, because it takes away their possibility to use protectionist measures, to have, protective taxation on certain goods, to try to, protect certain infant industries and that kind of thing, to actually get to a reasonable degree of economic development. We think that's something that you're taking away if you take away this nation state's power to enforce these policies, to enforce strong economic measures, strong economic regulation within their realm. We think by that you're making it harder for them to develop. Next thing they say, and that's very important, is that essentially under our side of the house, the weak states get oppressed. They get oppressed by, for example, China. We think it's way worse under their side of the house, because if they are eroding the sovereignty and the institutional power of these small nation states, what's going to happen is that the very big ones can implement the influence via economic measures, and that's what we're seeing right now. What usually military pressure or diplomatic pressure is very rare, but what China is doing right now is economic pressure. They're trying to coerce small countries economically, and we think that is way more likely under their side of the house, where you essentially via this globalization method, via the decline of the nation states, take away the ability of these small states to protect themselves by reasonable regulation, by reasonable taxation, by reasonable, prohibitions for import of certain goods, of that kind of thing. We think that is a problem on their side of the house. We think even if that doesn't happen, then the oppressing regime in a way will be multinational corporations. Even if you aren't oppressed by China anymore, under their side of the house, you're now oppressed by, Google, by British Petroleum, by Apple, by these kinds of corporations, which are under their side of the house, under little to no regulation. We think that is a huge problem. Now, if we go into even weaker democracy, into even weaker states, we have the problem that you're essentially destabilizing whole governments. You're likely going to take away their income. Yeah, they have less ability to develop themselves economically. They have less ability to enforce reasonable taxation. That takes away income. We think that to some extent will destabilize these governments, and we think that actually might, in many cases, make war, chaos, and revolutions more likely, and that's definitely not in the interest of the people. So what we're saying is, in general, this policy and this idea is hugely undemocratic, because the legitimate interests of the people in these countries cannot be enforced. Interests like, for example, a well-regulated financial sector, well-regulated privacy regulation, well-regulated, I don't know, ecology regulation, or progressive taxation, or that kind of thing. We think that is undemocratic, that violates the interests of the people, and in a way it's very dangerous, because what you have now under their side of the house is that you have these corporate overlords, which can move between states and do whatever they want without any reasonable regulation, and like they are inhuman. You have to acknowledge that these are not human beings. They are not led by individuals, but they are led by like the absurd desire for profit of thousands of individual shareholders. We think these are very dangerous overlords, and they are much more dangerous than the nation-state institutions that we have right now. So what we have in the end in this first half, we think. What we have on their side of the house is that essentially the nation states are then oppressed by corporations or by economic oppression. We think that's way worse. We think even if we don't have like all the individual freedom that they might have under their side of the house, people can still leave the countries in most cases, and at least on our side of the house, the legitimate interests of the people can be enforced, which cannot happen under their side of the house. We think on these grounds we are proud to stand in opposition.
We thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech, and now the House recognizes member for the government.
The concept of the social contract, which has been the basis for the nation state, will be beneficial for the average citizen in the state, is actually a fantasy. We believe that the counterfactual for the demise of the sovereignty of each nation is not a vacuum of power, but rather is the place where the diverse interest group or diverse non-governmental organizations are taking a place to compete for their own interests. More smaller civic societies are asking for their own right. We think the whole narrative coming from the opposition, as of which we are now having a vacuum of political power, and therefore we are going to suffer from all this problem, was now ignoring this counterfactual, or rather existing in the world. So, what we are mainly going to do as a closing government in this debate. First, we are going to prove to you why the concept of the nation state itself is inherently and going to structurally oppress the minority, but why now this kind of demise of the sovereignty and demise of the nation power is going to be better and complementary to these people who are oppressed and who are the minorities, and therefore better achieve a pluralistic society in the world. But second, we are also going to prove to you that who is going to better achieve a sustainable and stable society in terms of, say, economy, in terms of, say, like finance in the world. But before we move on to our own extension, the brief rebuttal directed to the opening opposition, which is not integrated in our own extension. First, they told us, look, this kind of power that is now going to be removed in the vacuum of the power of nation state, the stronger entity is going to come. Say China is going to dominate your economy. First of all, we think the problem with that is that the concept of the nation as a China existed at the first place. We think now the demise of the nation state as a concept, say China, is not going to create those kind of problems to begin with. Once the CCP is not pushing for the nationalistic identity or nationalistic interest to exploit the other countries, right? We don't think that was a proper example for them to bring upon. But furthermore, they never really proved to us that why the nation state's existence can actually solve all those problems to begin with once there inherently exists an imbalance of the power, right? We don't think in that sense like that opening opposition's case regarding this problem was really correct to begin with. Directly moving on to our own extension. First, we are going to prove to you that why inherently the concept of the nation state is oppressing people and oppressing people from opening into diverse identities and less possibility of self-actualizing their own identities. We believe that the concept of the nation state is based upon the social contract itself. But once it's based upon this idea of social contract, which homogenizes the interests of the people as a whole, which is not trying to neglect the fact there is going to be a conflict of interest existing, we think a different identity cannot be really respected, cannot be really reflected to the governmental organization. We think in the terms of the social integration process, we think there innately exists a power dynamic between the diverse group. And we believe in that process, the minorities are naturally going to be ruled out. Why is this so? Because we indeed believe that this concept of national identity or the power itself is based upon the utility of the society, and therefore making more and more people, the majority of the people, to opt into their own identity, which in fact is going to create a narrative that once there exists a conflict between the majority and the minority group, they're naturally going to rule out the minority identity from their own social contract. We think this is very harmful, and we think that's an innate part of the nation state as a whole, that which we even see from the most advanced form of democracy in the world. Even in the United States, still the LGBT right has not been fully achieved due to this kind of majoritarian rule which is oppressed by the nation state. We also believe that those kind of, in most extreme cases, it's not only about what opening government briefly mentioned to us is whether liberal or conservative identity you're subscribed to, but it's rather about most in extreme term of oppression of minorities. In Myanmar, that Muslim Rohingyas are being oppressed because of the identity of the nation is based upon the majority Buddhist state. We think in those kind of cases, the oppression of the minority is inherently harmful once the nation state's power is very, very strong. But on the counter narrative, what is on the other hand in the failure or in the decline of the nation state as a whole? Within this kind of decline of nation state, with the power, with the increasing of the globalization, is making people more and more possible to opt into diverse identity and more pluralistic society, which is going to allow them to evade from the tyranny of the majoritarian rule of the nation state. We think, for example, even if your country is now deprioritizing environment and trying to get maybe economic development, but if you are the environmentalist living in your own nation, we think that now individuals can self-actualize their own interests by opting into, Greenpeace, now doing the environmental activism or whatnot. We think that was only possible through the decline of the nation-state's identity, but the globalization, and therefore creating more and more people to subscribe to diverse identity, and we think that is good. But furthermore, we think in terms of labor right or that, we think it's also beneficial on our side, right? Because now all their harm regarding the exploitation was a problematic once you think that there is a vacuum of power existing. But we don't think so. We think now as a nation-state is declining, now there's less narrative for the, developing nation to push you this burden, say that you should be sacrificed in order for our nation's own economic growth, and therefore your exploitation can be justified under the name of the majority's benefit. We think rather, once the concept has been declined, and once, labor rights movement is going to be increased under the globalized nation, and once the NGOs for supporting that labor movement is going to increase, we think we can actually better achieve the labor right, which has been ignored in this kind of developing nations. Closing.
Ma'am, a globalized world is ultimately reliant on a free market system where corporations rule. Tell me, how are labor rights able to lobby with private entities such as corporations to be able for them to prioritize their rights?
First of all, what they have to prove is that why in the existence of the nation state itself, their problem is going to be solved once you recognize that already this kind of developing nations are heavily lobbied by the MNCs and also not really in the line of their own people, we think that is not really solving your own problem. So, moving on to our second extension in this case, we believe that yes, indeed, a better, sustainable, and stable society can be achieved under our own paradigm. Because we indeed believe that the nation state in the globalization context, it is more likely to be aggressive in terms of expansionism. We think especially if the state holds the power to recruit, soldiers, taxpayers' money, we think it's more likely it's going to be aggressive. We also think that all the harms coming from those kind of things, economic failure, are oftentimes a problem that has been caused by the nation state itself, unlike what we're trying to depict. Maybe this kind of economic crisis has been created by the quantitative easing of the majority of economic power within the world due to their own nation state's interests. We think that is not really the unique harm that can come from the decline of the nation state itself, rather so much strength of the nation state. But furthermore, we also believe that the more regulation can be actually achieved under our side once you recognize that difference of interest can be reflected through different people's own organization, not your government now homogenizing and assuming that what people's interest is going to be. We think it's going to be a better economic sustainability system once you recognize that how government cannot hold every people's information and interest, and therefore not going to make a better economic system as a whole. We think as a whole, in a fundamental level and also in a practical level, nation-state failure is beneficial for our work. Thank you.
For the speech, and invite the member for the opposition.
This debate has ended up in a tug of war between globalization and protectionism. Do we need it or do we not need it? And opening government did the unthinkable by assuming that globalization is fair. We think the discussion so far is muddled in the sense that what we need in this debate is discuss the very important actor which we're forgetting, the citizens, who are the reason for the economy, the people protected by the nation-state's power and the most affected by globalization. What closing opposition is going to discuss is what the citizens need from the nation-state's power, from globalization, and say that it's regrettable that given these needs, the nation-state's power is actually declining. What we're going to prove is firstly why in principle it is an injustice to these people, and second why we deprive them of the only protection from the ills of globalization. Government cannot make the mistake of saying that we are against globalization. What closing opposition is saying is that if it's going to happen anyway, then that is more reason why we need the nation-state to be powerful. Now, on to the responses. The mistake of opening government is to model out this debate and set it as a hypothetical. They evaluate the decline of power and say and celebrate it by comparing it against an imagined version of globalization, which isn't really feasible for the debate because imbalances are inherent. Countries have different starting points and sizes of economies. Countries have varied advantages and disadvantages, and resources are finite. Assuming fairness eliminates any reason to debate this motion because if things are fair in globalization, then there's no reason for us not to want the power of the state there. You have to assume some imbalance at some point. But even their argumentation on the benefits is illogical. The race to the bottom doesn't exist because of state power, but exists because of an inability of the state to control the actions of the corporations. Say what happened when we repealed Glass-Steagall, which was the country's only control over the actions of the banks. Or even the imposition of identity is a consequence of tax transfer when the United States starts to Americanize their former colonies. We think the OG case is simply untrue. But then we hear closing government and say that nation-states are oppressive and somehow argue against the existence of a nation-state. Their case is founded on a nation-state that is oppressive, which isn't what we're defending. But logically, it doesn't seem feasible because it's important for nation-states to pander to minority rights because it's what's necessary to maintain popular support. But all they need is a transfer of ideas, not the intermingling of economies, which is what they're defending. We think you only need to get the idea across through the internet, for example, and wait for organic change. In fact, what we say is that the nation-state in globalization is the only protection for minorities. Because fine, let's assume they're oppressive sometimes. What is their comparative? Corporations and trade pacts who are more powerful than the state, who are answerable to their own finances rather than minority rights. At least when the nation-state is more powerful, we have a promise of protection, no promise of protection for the most important people on government side. Before I move on, I'll take opening.
Notice that there are different starting points that each country has. Don't you think that political barrier is just another burden that they have to face? Wouldn't it better for a company to directly cooperate with other people?
The barrier is not political. The barrier is economic. When they are unequal, globalization cannot make them equal because they're going to have to depend on the bigger economies. More on that later. In principle, why is this incorrect? What I will argue is that even absent any consideration, just to accommodate government, absent any consideration on the merits of globalization, it's something that's incorrect if the nation state is declining. Because you have to understand the source of that power. The power that we're talking about was derived from a contract between the state and the people, insofar as the power exists so that the people may be protected. Several reasons why the decline creates the principal tension with this. First of all, the capacity of the people to protect themselves are diluted because the nation state is the embodiment of that protection. They have the power of the purse to write the law, the sword to enforce the law, and review to say what the law means. And we think under that kind of model, how a people live is no longer governed by what they want because foreigners who don't know anything about the country start to make and dictate decisions regarding that country. Decisions over the economy, should there be borders or protections? Decisions over our money, how much money can you withdraw from the ATM in a day, and decisions on what they need. We think that following this track, citizens lose their control over the country, which is a principal tension for what the power is supposed to stand for. Globalization is tempting. It seems to provide a heaven, that's what we're going to say. But we think the principal consequences, which is to say the right of the people to govern themselves, is not a feasible possible trade-off, which is why we regret that it is declining at all. But on the second argument, why we deprive people from the only shield of their only shield from the ills of globalization. We have to set out from the preconceived notions and evaluate globalization for what it is. It has its benefits, is that it has its harms later. We say that it has many faults. Mostly, because of the imbalance, it results in unequal trading paths. Talk about the TPP, where big states who have bigger industries outcompete the industries of the smaller states. We think what that situation ends up in is that smaller countries end up buying from big states more than what they are able to sell, which creates a large trade deficit where smaller states grow more dependent and the West or the bigger states grow richer. Three consequences. We think first it results in heavy unemployment because the result of the entrance of the high-tech industries is that we employ less people because the advanced technology of the West makes these smaller countries more no longer rely on labor. We think it also leads to foreign control. For example, the Greeks couldn't control how much money they could withdraw from their funds. And we think it leads to inequality such that the position bigger countries find themselves in is that their home economies grow stronger and the target industries, the developing states, grow weaker. What is the comparative? We think what we envision on opposition side is a probable growth that is slower than what we experience with globalization, at the point in which globalization exists. It's the worst case if nation states are protectionist. We think an important trade-off is at least we're able to protect the right of the citizens to control the resources around them, because it's the reason why we have an economy to begin with, an efficient distribution of resources in order to serve the people. We think the more likely scenario is that we're able to build competitiveness such that even if you have free trade growing all around, countries to one extent have the ability to mirror the case of Japan, where we have excessive controls over our home industries, afford them all kinds of protections so that it's easier for us to come at the point we're able to compete properly because our industries are developed. If we take a bite on the Pandora's box of globalization, we find ourselves trapped in inequality, and that's what's happening now. If the nation states were more powerful than what they are, than how powerful they are now, maybe we could have turned this around, maybe we could have done something better, which is why that decline is something we deeply regret.
We thank the member of opposition for that speech, and to conclude the debate for the government side, the House recognizes Government Whip.
We think when closing opposition tells us that, hey, the inequality of economy size exists even with and without the decline of nation concept, what we have to deal with in today's debate eventually becomes who actually exacerbates the inequality in the end. With the stronger concept of nations, were we able to fight inequality, or were we able to actually combat the powerful and defend the minority in the end? We think basically what the whole upbench actually supports is equality of power between nations rather than necessarily stronger concept of nations. Given that, when we have to recognize that when nations were much stronger than before, say when nations were much more nationalistic and nations have much more control over its people, more inequality actually existed, and that's what actually led to imperialism, right? So we don't think naturally what upbench supports as equality of all nations naturally come with stronger concept of nations. We first want to question that, and we don't think any speakers from opposition were able to answer why stronger concept of nation literally means equality of power between different nation states to begin with, because we don't think that is the case. But yeah, if you want to answer that, yeah.
We have found no system that protects minorities better than the democratic nation state. You have no alternative.
Well, we first told you in member speech, but that's exactly what I'm going to talk about during my 7-minute speech as a whole, right? We told you, hey, decline of nation state does not mean vacuum of any political power. We told you that basically nation states, also the most democratic nation states, are at the same time the most oppressive states against minorities, and that they structurally rule out the interests of minority and politically powerless in their nations. We told you, rather we think with the decline of nation states, minorities are probably more able to defend their interests right now, and I'm going to talk about this point at this moment. We think in the end this debate boiled down to the question of whether decline of nation states' power actually lead to more or less oppression in the end. But we told you, we on Closing Government told you why through nation states, the inequality in power dynamics that exist in the status quo or exist in a society is more institutionalized. We think the major question of upbench is this: can a laborer or a labor worker defend his interest against a multinational corporation when nation state is gone, right? That's basically the rhetorical and the substantive question that the whole upbench was obsessed about. We think in CG, basically, we think if laborers were better able to, say, unionize or act against the corporates, corporations would not have had the power to exploit them if it had not been the nation state that were behind them, giving them with law and legislation more power to exploit upon these laborers, and gave the labor unions less power to unionize upon these corporations, against these corporations, and took away, through legislation and law, their power to fight against corporations to begin with. We think basically that is exactly what's happening in the most democratic states that you wish to talk about, like America. Basically, we think what happens is that through having a stronger concept of nation and the government having more power to institutionalize people into the legislation that people have to opt into and forcefully, we think basically people are losing our power. We think basically if laborers were able to go on strikes when they think working conditions are shitty, we don't think MNCs really had any power against these people if they had the power to begin with. But we think basically what institutionally took away power from these laborers to begin with were governments rather than, say, corporations to begin with. We think given that inequality would exist, we have to consider who, through better mechanism, will be able to defend their interests. We think nation state is a horrible idea to do so, and we don't think democracy really does it. Then comes CEO saying these things, right? Hey, minorities' rights are in line with nations' interests. So nations are, because they have to gain popular support and popularity, the governments in these states are going to talk to the minorities and yes, defend their interests in the end, right? But we think basically we have to recognize and understand that minorities' rights and interests are often extremely exclusive to that of the majority's interests and the powerful's interests in these societies. Given that, we think basically lobbying has worked against many of the laborers inside the United States. We don't think it is going to work in line for these people when their interest is exclusive to those powerful, with those having a lot of money, those with a lot of political capital to lobby the congressman to begin with. So we think when you have to understand the context behind that basically their interests are likely to be very, very exclusive and therefore not going to be defended through a democratic government you talk about, we don't think you really take this debate home. No, sir. Let's talk about why Closing Government told you why rights of people are not going to be embodied through nationalistic institutions to begin with. Because we don't think national institutions are able to, in the end, incorporate the largest amount of people's identities in the end. We told you, I already took one. So it's not last chance. So basically we think rights of people cannot be embodied simply through the incorporation of them stronger incorporation of them into national institutions, because basically we think individuals have too diverse interests and identities to begin with. We think basically nation states are never going to realize the most part of your identities because they have limited capital to begin with and they have limited course of political institution to communicate with you to begin with. We think we told you why individuals are better realizing themselves by opting into things like LGBT movement or things like environmental movement that your government is not going to bring to you, and we told you why you not relying on your government but being able to rely on more civic unions, and why you being able to rely on cooperating with people from other side of the world that share the same interests with you or share the same identity with you is stronger and much more beneficial in terms of your self-actualization and self-realization. But at the same time, your direct influence on political sphere itself. Basically, we think this is the difference. When the American government would never listen to you in terms of you as an environmentalist saying that these people necessarily have to sacrifice their CO2 emission in order to, say, work for the environment in the end. We think basically what you can do in the demise of nationalistic narrative and in the rise of more globalization narrative is that you can opt into, say, organizations like Greenpeace and decide to act on environmental vigilantism instead. We think through that you rather have more power against these corporations because you're actually doing something against these corporations, say, not buying their products or saying doing a vigilantism against these corporations. We think that's good. Basically, we think the whole upbench relies on this idea that equality of nation is going to come when more nation states are stronger. But we're telling you that it's not going to come, rather nation states institutionalize the inequality of power dynamics you have there. Thank you.
We thank the government whip for the speech, and to conclude this debate, the House recognizes the opposition.
Is this bendable? I'm too small. Oops. Government side claims that as we open our borders, everyone benefits as the entire world gets developed. Everyone gets to form their own national identity. Everybody gets to renegotiate their values with entities like corporations. Basically, the rising tide lifts all boats. Unfortunately, the truth is that a rising tide lifts only the largest ships and sinks the smallest vessels. In that case, we need a benevolent entity. We need an entity that's legally accountable to be able to regulate the movements of this rising tide, to be able to make sure that the smallest vessels are able to survive this storm. We think that nation states are the ample body to do that. The first thing I want to reconcile in this debate is what really happens in a globalized world. Because notice that to be able to understand the dynamic of the nation state within that globalized world, we first have to examine what it really means. Government claims that when nation states decline in their capacity for regulation, that means that the globalized world will automatically have economic interdependence and world peace. This is a false world to paint, Madam Speaker. We think that globalization does not automatically lead to an equality among countries. In fact, as globalization, as OG correctly characterizes, is only the decline of government economic control. The world, therefore, as we told you, coming from closing opposition, is ultimately reliant on the free market mechanism. That's why opening government's model of ultimate equality, therefore, cannot exist in their model. Because what did Jason tell you? What happens within a free market system? We think that naturally states have different starting points. Therefore, what happens within the world is dependent on how economic entities are able to make use of an environment where there is less economic regulations. Why is that bad? We told you, coming from Jason, 3 reasons why that's bad. Obviously, when you have less regulations, that means that stronger entities within stronger nations, like MNCs from the United States of America and the developed world, will ultimately go to developing nations in order to make sure that they're able to get the most out of those resources. What are the implications that we brought out to you exclusively coming from closing opposition? Firstly, we told you that underemployment or even unemployment is larger, ladies and gentlemen, which ultimately means that citizens in the weakest nations are unable to compete because naturally machines are cheaper, and secondly, naturally, all of these employees will have to have labor rights. Naturally, these employees will have have larger costs in order for their human rights to be upheld. We think that that's something that you cannot ultimately control under a model where you're ultimately reliant on economic entities. Secondly, we told you that inherently, given the different starting points, economic inequality is bound to happen among nations. Because naturally, if some states are able to make better use out of that economic environment, like the developed world gets more taxes out of their MNCs being able to expand into these countries, naturally what's going to happen is that some countries are going to be stronger, which ultimately means that you're never able to resolve the problems that opening government brought out. Because not naturally, the insecurities exist because some militaries are stronger, because their economies are stronger, Madam Speaker, and we think that without the capacity of the developing world to be able to control their own economies, then naturally they will lose out within that process. That was never responded to coming from closing government. But lastly, what we told you coming from Jason, in fact, was that given the economic interdependence, now states have the capacity to say, like politically stronger states now have the capacity to dictate over developing countries or even smaller countries what they're supposed to do, because now we're economically interdependent. I mean, we've seen that with Greece, with the EU trying to force certain austerity measures within the Greek economy, because now they have the excuse to say our economy is interdependent and you have to follow what we're saying. In fact, notice that the race to the bottom effect happens because more MNCs expand and more laborers feel the need to reduce their wages in order to be able to compete against companies. We say that that's the natural consequence of all the globalization that exists within the world. That's why, that's the consideration that we have to make in this debate. Before I move on to the second discussion, yes.
The problem is the motion doesn't want the opposition to defend only stronger, weaker nations, only giving more power to weaker nations. But given that there are different economic sizes to begin with, don't you recognize that stronger nations were able to institutionalize their interests with bigger economic sizes through having more national power?
I don't think so, because in a world where you don't have economic interdependence, that means that developing nations are still able to fight for their rights as economic entities and are able to regulate within their borders. So we say that that particular problem is better resolved on our side of the house, as we told you coming from closing opposition. Now, given that world, is the decline of nation states good, given this context, right? The first thing that we brought out to you coming from closing opposition exclusively was the idea of this social contract, right? We think that in principle, it's incorrect to have a decline of states because naturally that nation state was created in order to make sure that there's an entity that's legally accountable and that's benevolent enough to make sure that our interests as citizens are protected. That's why in a globalized world, where you have nation states declining, that means that the capacity of citizens to control the circumstances that they are under is much lessened. And we think in principle that is incorrect because firstly, the social contract dictates that nation states should be able to shield you from all of the harms that we're able to talk about coming from closing opposition. So in principle, regardless of the merits and demerits of globalization, we cannot support this particular idea. But there are three other reasons why we think that nation states are particularly important. Firstly, we don't think that corporations are actually answerable to workers or the very vulnerable within societies, right? What did we tell you coming from Jason? We think that given that laborers and civic unions, ladies and gentlemen, are economically dependent on corporations, we think their capacity to negotiate all of the ideals with these private entities are lessened. Because obviously, if you're going to strike, that means that there's a capacity for that corporation to remove you from from your positions and instead reinstate other individuals and reinstate other laborers. So we don't really think that private entities have that incentive to protect you. But secondly, we think that even if there's politicization or even the fact that there are some dominant majorities that rule within democratic systems, we think that at the very least in the comparative, states are bound to renegotiate their concept of identity because naturally in a democratic system, states are accountable to the citizens and we think that minorities have to be heard. That's why we think that if we're going to the direct response to the closing government's case about opt-ins, we think that it's better to opt in under a system where nation states are stronger because at the very least, given that strengthening of the democratic systems, advocacies are stronger when it is made legal through the nation states. Panel, what you have to remember is that ultimately, in principle, we have to make sure that nation states are there because ultimately they're the only defense that citizens have in this globalized world. With that, we're very proud to oppose.
We thank the opposition whip for that speech. We thank all the debaters for the debate. One more round of applause for the ESL finalists.